Good morning. My name is Brent Holmes. I'm the Assistant Director for the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies here at Grand Valley State University. I just want to start by thanking you for joining us as we celebrate the 10th annual Hidden Wounds of War Conference. It's quite an accomplishment. As a veteran myself, I am honored to be affiliated with an organization founded by a legendary brother in arms, Colonel Ralph W. Hauenstein. It is through the generous gifts of our donors and members that we are able to partner with the West Michigan Veterans Coalition and others to bring you today's programming. On behalf of the Hauenstein Center, again, I just want to welcome you, and we hope that you enjoy today's conference. At this point, I'd like to introduce psychologist Dr. Michael Ryan, who works with veterans and is one of the founders of the program back in 2008. So, Dr. Ryan.
Great. I want to welcome you this morning. This is our 10-year anniversary of this conference. And I am so proud to have been associated with it. And I'd like to take just a little time and give you the history of the conference to help you kind of understand what our goals are. Now, this kind of thing can be deadly boring, so I apologize. I'll try to keep it short. But I'll tell you, I've had the privilege of working with such amazing people over the last 10 years. I want to take a moment just to recognize them, and a couple in particular. This whole process grew out of a conversation I had with a friend of mine, Carolyn Schroeder, in 2006. She's a social worker, and I'm a neuropsychologist, and we know a little bit about PTSD and what happens to the body when you're in these kinds of traumatic situations. And we both were concerned that there was no way, given what was happening in the war, that we were going to have enough mental health people really to help our soldiers as they returned. And as we began talking more about it, Carolyn began to open up to me a little bit, and let me actually introduce her. Carolyn, her name is Carolyn Schroeder, please stand up. She's a brilliant social worker, and her father was in the Pacific Theater in World War II. And after his death, she began to contact members from his company, and his company was Company G, 2nd Platoon, 5th Division. Did I get that right? 2nd Battalion. Oh, sorry about that. And these men, I think, because she was the daughter of a fellow soldier, they really welcomed her in. And in fact, she got so close that she was the chairperson of one of their last reunions. But she is such a warm, giving person and loving. I think immediately these soldiers, these veterans, began to trust her and really care about her. And certainly I've been touched by how much she cared and loved these men. It was wonderful to watch. But also being a social worker, she began interviewing them, talking to them about their feelings and what was going on. And what she discovered, and she interviewed dozens and dozens, she found out that a significant proportion of these men were still suffering from PTSD. Now, for me, this was just incredible, because these men, growing up, these men were my heroes. These men had saved democracy, really saved the world from fascism, and then they'd come home and really made America great. After this incredible accomplishment, they were the men and women who really built this country. And yet, many of them were working hard. They were very successful. They were bankers and lawyers and teachers. And at night, they'd suffer from the effects of the PTSD throughout their lives, even into their 80s and 90s. And they never got any help. And this was tragic. And I think in some ways, it was even harder for the Vietnam vets. So Carol and I began to talk about this, and the men and women who were coming home, we didn't want this to happen to them. So we began to do research, and one of the things we saw that was really needed was to increase awareness of combat PTSD and try to alleviate the stigma. So we got this idea of having a presentation where I would present the neuropsychological piece, you know, and demonstrate, and we have good scientific evidence that this problem is really a brain injury. It's not a flaw in character or a weakness. The brain really is injured. And so I presented that information, and Carolyn did a beautiful job of presenting the stories of these men who'd been in the worst, some of the worst fighting in World War II, and what happened to them when they returned home. We approached the Hallenstein Center about whether they might be interested in this, and Glees Whitney was a tremendous supporter. He went into it full speed, if you will. He helped us with the promotion, connections, putting it all together, and he recommended a man he knew who had been in Vietnam and had suffered PTSD, Jim Hodges. Let's see here. This is a picture of Carolyn with her veterans at the reunion. And so in the year, well, it was June 17th, 2008, we gave our presentation. It was a day-long presentation. We had over 200 attendees, and it went very, very well. I think the highlight, as you can imagine, was Jim, who was just so real, and people connected, and it was just an incredible conference. And from that, we put together a committee to try to work and promote information and so forth on combat PTSD. A couple years later, after we'd been working on this and thinking of different ways we could help, we were blessed by the arrival for our committee of Chaplain Herman Kaiser, who was a phenomenal man. He was ordained in 1968 and commissioned as a chaplain in 1968. He was one of the few, and went to Vietnam, and he was one of the few chaplains who really went in country with his men, and was severely injured twice, had 2 Purple Hearts. He himself then later, one of the things, he fell out of a helicopter. You know, this is not what you sign on for when you become a minister, you know, but he ended up struggling with PTSD himself because of his experiences. And from there, he went on to just, I don't have time to talk about his career, the things he did, the people he advised, on all the honors he achieved. It was incredible. And towards the end of his career, which really lasted probably the day before he left us, knowing Herm, he began working on the concept of moral injury. The idea that not only there are physical hidden wounds and psychological hidden wounds, but there's spiritual hidden wounds as well. And he really became a leader, helped write one of the seminal books in this area. And he helped us greatly as we tried to put together a sense of what our purpose was as a committee. And the idea is we wanted to set up a community, really encourage, I guess you'd say, a community response to our returning soldiers that looked at the medical, the psychological, and the spiritual aspects, and included veterans and their families, but also doctors, social workers, psychologists, and ministers, so we can work together to welcome these men and women home, and really, in a sense, not leave anyone behind. We've asked for such sacrifices from these men and women, and as a culture, I think we really, it's our duty to really help them come home and integrate. And so that's what the conference has been. Herm provided tremendous leadership and guidance to the committee. He was kind of our spiritual leader, if you will. And unfortunately, we lost him last year. It's a tremendous loss, I think, for all of us and for everyone who knew him. He was an incredible scholar, an amazing pastor, a gifted clinician. I've been practicing for 35 years, and I was always struck by his insights and his knowledge, and just a very, very good friend. So we really wanted to dedicate this conference to him and to his legacy. The next major conference we had was in 2014. Carolyn, as you saw, presented, oops, actually that's that one, okay. The 2014 conference, we had Dr. Jonathan Shea speak, Rita Brock, Stephen Sinakis, and then Herman gave a fabulous presentation. And from there, we really launched into a series of conferences which I think have been very helpful, looking at different aspects, problems that occur. Let me just quickly go over, because we've really been lucky to have fabulous people on the committee. Herman being the top one, Gleaves Whitney, Alana Bridges, who you'll see a lot of, has been seminal. She is the worker. She is the brains behind this organization. Stephen Lipnick, Dr. Mark Kane, Dr. William Busby, Mark Gleason, myself. Again, in the next conference, it was Herman, Gleaves, Alana, kind of the same cast of characters. And then for this conference, it was been Gleaves, Alana, Stephen, Bart, and Brent. And so I'd ask the committee to stand up. They've worked tirelessly for the last year. Please give them a round of applause. I thank you for coming today. And I hope you just have a very excellent experience. And please give us feedback. We want to make these even better. So thank you very much. Oh, I'm sorry, I got, what we'd like to do, and Carolyn, could you come up too? As kind of founders of this, we wanted to give Herman's wife, Artisan, some flowers. And again, thank her for the contribution her husband made, but she's also been a tireless worker as well. In the last 3 or 4 conferences, you could always see her out registering people and making sure everything was going well. So please come up. All right, this is your special day.
See you. We love you. Thanks for all you've done for us.
Thank you, and thanks for remembering her.
Absolutely. Well, thank you.
Give her a hand.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you. I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Buechner. He's an adjunct professor at Adler University, Master's in Psychology with an emphasis in military psychology program. In addition to supervising student capstone projects, Dr. Buechner teaches courses in operational psychology, research methods, morality, ethics, and social justice. He also serves as a Michigan State Vice Chair of the National Committee for Employer Support and of the Guard and Reserve, is a Veteran Knowledge Community Representative for the National Association of Student Program Administrator, Region 5 East, and is a member of the boards of directors of the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution and the Chris Kyle Frog Foundation. Dr. Buechner is a retired captain, 30 years in the military. He will be presenting the overview of the invisible scars, how to treat combat stress, and PTSD without medication. Dr. Buechner.
I think I'm on. Thank you, Elena. I was reminded by Elena earlier I have two functions in this section. One is to keep the program on schedule, which I will do my best to do. So at 9:45, we'll be turning it over to Dr. Joseph Troiani to talk a little bit about some of the things that in his experience for many, many years as a professor of psychology. The other function is to try to convey a little bit of a sense of the conference around which the book that you now have was based. And Dr. Bart Billings, Colonel Bart Billings was not able to come, so because I was the other Bart in the group, I'm going to cover his piece of the action. At least I'm going to do my best to approximate what he would have shared with us. But some of the things in the introductory remarks that are very salient to what he would have shared with you if he were here is that this really is a life and death deal. And I think I don't have to remind anybody in this group, or having walked around, talked to a few people before we got started, that this is an important thing. Now, how many of you all here in the room would self-identify as veterans? Okay. So we don't need to explain a lot of the context to you all. How many are in the social work profession? Social work, okay. Social workers are totally awesome. I worked for many years at the California Department of Veterans Affairs in a veterans home, and the social workers made that place run. How many of you all would consider yourself primary? And there's going to be a lot of overlapping identities here. Family members? Family members of veterans? Okay. Very cool. That's, again, the family is an essential thing, and a lot of what what I'm going to talk about later today is about social connections and how that plays an incredible role, not only in addressing issues that arise in our lives, and they do arise for all of us, but also in just how we're stronger together. And there might not be today a lot of blinding flashes of revelation for you, but there hopefully will be some data and inputs that help you to think about some of these issues that we have in a new way. And again, channeling Bart Billings right now, one of those is to be an activist. Make things happen. Don't just kind of watch and say, okay, this is bad mojo. Oh, we're being screwed again. This is not right. Don't just do that, and you'll see when you get into his book, and I again advise everybody to please take this book home and read it from cover to cover and think about it, not necessarily in a linear way. Just go to the stuff that seems to speak to you, take a look at that. He is one of the most ardent critics of over-medication in the military and through the VA. That is not to... This is not speaking for him. This is not to criticize any profession or any entity. We're all doing the best we can to try to deal with the things we have with the tools that we've got. But again, where this conference comes from is a space of integrative medicine, integrative perspectives, which means it's all important. And that's if we leave you with nothing else today, at least in the things that I want to share, it's pretty much that. So the book comes from 45 years of experience of Bart Billings as a military leader and as a clinician. It also comes from 24 years of this conference on invisible wounds, and the International Military and Civilian Stress Conference is the most recent iteration of that. And I'm going to ask one of our star graduates from Adler Masters in Military Psych program, Denise Daly, to come up here and talk a little bit about that, because we have spent some time together in that space. There's Denise, and there's Bart Billings, and she's kind of surrounded by Barts in this picture. But this was 2 years ago, and it was a profound experience. Now, Randall Locke, who's standing up, is also a graduate of the MAMP program. And Denise, you do not have to come up just yet, so we're going to get to that later. But since Randall's standing up, there's two of our graduates. Please give him a hand. Randall's a retired Marine, and he's also, since graduating, taken over as a student veteran coordinator at Jackson College, doing a bang-up job down there. And as again, many of you know, education is a big part of what overcoming invisible wounds is all about, and that's something I'm going to get into a little bit later on. But this whole idea that the conference started out on Camp Pendleton. It was about combat stress. Bart is a big proponent of looking at combat stress as a phenomenon unto itself, and looking at any disease, disorder, disability, or anything else that starts with D as something that we've kind of constructed around that as an effort to help, but sometimes it doesn't help. So the notion is that post-traumatic stress and traumatic stress are just ways of our body doing its best to keep us alive in very adverse situations. What happens later on, and there's some really good work coming out now. Dr. Joe Bonanno at Columbia University has written about transition stress. And this is one of those metaphorical shifts that I'd ask you to give some thought to, is that a lot of our consideration of post-traumatic stress has been to think about the stress-producing event itself. What was the nature of that? The traditional model of PTSD is its violence, its fear of death. It's something that gets embodied in us, and those are the therapies that we've created around that. As we start talking in this community about moral injury, it's more about what are the guilt and shame and the other higher human responses to things that just aren't right and are out of balance. So as we start thinking about moral injury, then it's somewhat about the things that happen that trigger that response in us, but it's really about the other things that we see in the world around us that are re-triggering those responses, and so we have this drive to do something about it, or get pulled in by it. So these are our stories that we have, and so one question around that is, do we have the stories, or do the stories have us? And hopefully what we can talk about today is some strategies where we as a community can help to own those stories and change those stories in some positive ways. One of the areas that the conference had in Carlsbad has moved towards, and in its most recent years, they've moved it from a military base on into a holistic wellness center. That is not an accident. Holistic wellness, mindfulness is a big part of being able to think differently about our experiences and take control over them and manage them in some way. So you can see that the materials and the material that's covered, the phenomena themselves, suicide, grief and loss, nightmares, blast injuries, these are all somewhat symptomatic. And then we have some causal factors here, like the way that terrorism works, and how our military culture versus civilian culture triggers things for us. What does reintegration look like? And again, Stephen Zanakis was here a while ago. I had the pleasure to work with him when I was in California, along with a fellow named Joe Bobrow, who's written a great book. I'm not up here plugging books, by the way, but I will probably mention a few. And this one, Waking Up from War by Joe Bobrow, is really a good one if you're interested in understanding the community aspect. And Stephen Zanakis and Joe Bobrow were colleagues. So when we start thinking about mindfulness practices and community, the fact that this venue had shifted, here we are on a college campus, which sends a message in itself. The other thing that Bart Billings would have been more adamant about than I will be, and not because I don't believe in this as strongly as he does, but he would have a different way of conveying this than I am. But the notion that the medications, the psychotropics that we're using have uses, they are effective in some things, but they are not by themselves or should be considered by themselves to be treatments because they merely mask the symptoms of what's going on. So again, we think today about metaphorical shifts, or in this discussion that we're having. One of the metaphorical shifts is from psychological issues being caused by chemical imbalances in the brain, and rather than being manifestations of our humanity that can be detected through neuroscience and increasingly effectively detected by neuroscience so that we can see what's going on and have an understanding of it. So there's this notion of causality, and I hope that I'm saying it in a clear enough way that gets through just how fundamental this shift is. Another person, if you are interested in this, at Cleveland State University, there's a Dr. Elliot Ingersoll who's written a wonderful book on integral psychotherapy. He's just an inspiring human being, but he has a YouTube out. So if you are fond of YouTubes and want to Google Elliot Ingersoll and suicide and violence, Google those three things and you'll find a wonderful YouTube that he talks about what psychologists really do, what psychiatrists really do, and where medication is not what it's being portrayed to be in the advertising that we see. So his thought, and I have to say just a personal comment here. One of the programs that I was very pleased to get started when I was with the state of California was called the Pathway Home. Some of you may remember just a few weeks ago there was a national news story where there was a young man in a program in Northern California who very tragically took his own life, took the lives of 3 clinicians who were working with him at this veterans home. That was at the Pathway Home. And we don't know all the answers, we don't know what was going on with him, but we know there were a lot of things out of alignment, and thank God there was enough awareness in the community that the crazy vet narrative didn't get started after that. There was a huge outpouring of compassion, both for this young man who reached a point in his life which may or may not have involved psychotropic medications and impairment of judgment, that he resorted to taking his own life and took 3 people with him who were dedicated, they dedicated their entire lives to helping and supporting veterans. So when we said earlier on, this is life and death matter, this is a life and death matter. And it's going to take all the knowledge that we have, both in the sciences and in our humanities and in our philosophy, to really get a handle on that. So how we are as people and how we are as communities is very, very important here. This is a quote that many of you have heard. It's been around. Dr. Billings has been known to utter it frequently, and that's that basically traumatic stress is a normal response to abnormal situations. And the thinking process is, if it's going to add the D, if it's going to go into a disorder or something that impedes us in our daily activities, it's going to be because it's developed into that, because we haven't found a way to normalize it and manage it. And we're going to hear today some ideas about how integrated therapies and integrated approaches can help with that normalization and management process and lead to real change and lasting change. So again, the message is that again, I know a lot of people who couldn't function without some form of medication, and it can be very helpful if it's managed properly. But there are some things, particularly antidepressants, that can interfere with our survival instincts, and that can be a problem. My good friend and colleague Jeff Bird is going to come and talk a little bit later on about ways to think about that. as in the interpersonal space, how that affects our responses and our survival ability. This is one, again, if you're fond of Googling things and looking at YouTube videos, Jeffrey Lewine, who is a translational neuroscience professor, was a speaker last year at the Combat Stress Conference, and he's got, again, you know, we could amuse you guys for hours with imaging of the brain that shows where different neurons are firing when different things are going on, and it's a fascinating study. So just some of the new tools are up there. If anybody can say these, electroencephalography, magnetic resonance imaging, that's an easy one. Single photon emission, computed tomography, 6 times fast. So these are some very sophisticated techniques, and they're telling us quite a lot about what is going on in the brain. But again, what's going on in the brain is a result of a mirror, in a way, of what is going on in our lives, and it's a response to that. And so understanding it helps us in different ways to engage with it. It's again one of those background factors. Another thing that we talked about quite a lot with Dr. Billings in preparing for this conference was choice theory and how that relates to the management of depression. You'll see in the book that he talks a lot about his relationship with William Glasser and his notions of choice therapy and how that helps us to make real and lasting changes in our lives. It is definitely worth digging into a little bit further if you are in a position to work with this. So Glasser's hypotheses basically start out that we have 5 basic needs as human beings. You could go into Maslow's hierarchy of needs if you like that one. There's a lot of good sociological theories that touch on these phenomena. But the notion is there are 5 of them, and that we engage those all the time. Whether we do it well or not is another question. So what choice therapy causes us to do is come back and take a look at where these things might be misaligned, where we might be moving into conflict with other people in our lives as a result of these, and how we can manage our symptoms by changing the way we engage in our social worlds. So that's one, again, I'll commend to your, first looking in the book for the references to it, and then maybe getting into it further yourselves if this is something that's interesting and possibly useful to you. The other way to think about things is just in the notion of how therapies are integrative and what is integrative practice. James Greenblatt is a proponent of this integrative process. Also, is anybody familiar with Saybrook University? Saybrook? Okay, it's one of those, sometimes people call it the far out university on the left coast. They're in California. But they're doing quite a lot of very effective work. I have a colleague in the Netherlands that's working on a project with the Dutch government on how mental health is integrated with their physical health system. It seems like it's an easy thing to say that, but it's very hard to really do it. But basically, that's kind of it in a nutshell. There's a field of study called somatics, which is how our bodies process the way that we think of things. There is a field of study called phenomenology, which has more syllables than most Marines would recognize as being legitimate. Randall. And yet, it's a study of our consciousness, and it gets down to the fundamentals of how we process reality. So the idea here then is that an integrative theory or an integrative approach is one where we consider both the legitimate impacts that our medical profession can bring to the understanding of how we engage with the world, and how other things like mindfulness practices and the arts and literature. One of the things I'm very interested in now is working with veterans in the arts and literature, and I'll get a chance to talk about that later, so I'm not going to do it now. But again, you have a copy of the book waiting for you, and now I'd like to ask Randall and Denise to come up to help make a transition here, as we are fortunate to have with us Dr. Joseph Troiani, who helped get the program, a master's degree program, which is non-clinical, started at the Adler University in Chicago. And Adler is one of those, Alfred Adler, come on up guys. Adler is one of those characters who is both a veteran and a psychologist, and who is a compatriot of Sigmund Freud and studied with Freud, and then after his experiences in wartime came back and told Freud, hey, you know, you've got some really great ideas here, but what's really important is the way that we connect with each other in our social worlds. So without further impact, Denise, I'd like you to say just a little bit about your experience of the conference. Okay. and wind up and help introduce Dr. Troiani. But first, Randall, let me bring you up first. Let's just do that. Could you just say a little bit about something that maybe Dr. Troiani influenced you on while you were at Adler? Haha, this is a surprise.
Yeah.
Pop quiz.
This is what they call being blindsided, folks. But that's okay. Most of us can speak. Honestly, the overall experience at Adler was phenomenal. The program was roughly in its infant stages. I think Denise and I were in the second cohort to have launched into the Masters in Military Psychology program. And truthfully, I had found it by accident. I was looking for something that would advance me professionally, and in working with veterans. I've been working with vets for about 10 years now, and just happened to find the program. And I called Chicago. I was living in Phoenix, Arizona at the time. I called Chicago. Dr. Troiani was available, and stood in a parking garage in the heat, the summer heat, Phoenix, Arizona, on my cell phone and spoke to him for, God, we were on the phone for about 2 hours. I ran out of battery. And spoke several times after that, and he didn't sell me on the program. I was sold. I mean, it was just that good from the outset. And launching into it, just the guidance, the direction, the information was phenomenal. I joke all the time, as a vet and having spent a little time in combat, the program enabled me to figure out what my problem was. And it also enabled me to see things in veterans that wasn't quite clear before. And having that understanding, it just, you know, it puts us way ahead of where we were in the past in being able to help veterans and enable them to move forward.
Thank you, Randall. I appreciate it. Now, you and I are going to get out of here and let Denise introduce Dr. Troiani. So thank you very much. Denise, it's yours. Got to leave that clicker for him, too.
Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. First, I want to start off by just asking all of the veterans in here just to stand up for a moment. Wow. Thank you all so much. From the bottom of my heart, I just want to extend gratitude from myself and our team. We appreciate all the sacrifices that you've made, and we're honored to be in this time, in this place, where we can provide support to not only our OIF and our OEF veterans, but also those from different campaigns. We hope that we're living up to your expectations. And one of the things that we really hone in on is that you can mitigate symptoms, you can reduce symptoms of combat stress and PTSD, but that does not ensure that a veteran is going to have a quality of life. At the Combat Stress Conference in Carlsbad, we learned about a wide range of innovative services, cutting-edge services to integrate into the treatment plans for veterans. Dr. Bart Billings, he is a pioneer in the field of complementary and alternative medicine and integrating those concepts with military medicine. Starting in 2015, I began attending the conference, and within 3 days of returning back to Washington, D.C., myself and my father, who's a combat veteran, established Our Daily Bread, which is a for-profit agency that provides service coordination and clinical case management to homeless veterans in DC. The services that Dr. Bart Billing discussed, nutrition therapy, art therapy, Reiki, reflexology, they were all new concepts to us. We had no idea that these type of practices were available. And so what we wanted to do was make those available to marginalized populations. And we decided to do our flagship in Washington, D.C. because they have the seventh largest homeless veteran population in America. What that evolved into was a program that provided DD2 14 upgrades, mobile spiritual services where we had non-denominational pastors finding homeless veterans in the streets and praying with them, help restore hope, help bring peace of mind, and then also providing 1 to 2 hour sessions of Reiki therapy and reflexology once a week. So it evolved into this phenomenal program, and right now we've serviced over 150 veterans in the greater metropolitan area. While receiving training at the Combat Stress Conference, I was also a student of Dr. Troy Yami, who's just been such a blessing to myself and my family, and also hundreds of veterans in the greater Washington area. And I'm so grateful for this man. Not only is he the past president of the Illinois Psychological Association, but he is prior Navy. He's a Navy intelligence officer who did 32 years in the military. And if you ask him, he would go back today. Also, he is the director of the Military Psychology Masters of Arts program at Adler University and a published author. It's been a privilege to be close to you and be near to you during this exciting time. One thing I will also mention about Dr. Troiani is that he has been one of the key change makers in getting prescriptive authority privileges extended to psychologists in Illinois, and that deserves a round of applause. With psychologists being allowed to prescribe medication and unprescribed medication to veterans, that alleviates some of the pressure off of psychiatrists and the Veteran Administration to serve the veteran population. And so, without further ado, I just want to introduce him.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for everything that you've done.
Oh, pleasure. Thanks, Kara. Denise comes from a truly joint service family. As she mentioned, her father is a medically retired Army veteran, Ranger, in fact, if I remember correctly, wounded in Afghanistan. And her mother is currently on active duty in Japan. Her mom's Navy Medical Corps. So they had to be an interesting household, Army-Navy. I wonder what happened when they had the Army-Navy games. Well, good morning. I really appreciate the invitation to be out here today. Came up last night. Beautiful city, Grand Rapids. I vacationed here last year. Fantastic presidential library and a big Navy exhibit, of course. President Ford served in World War II in the United States Navy. As she mentioned a little bit about my background, I've spent 25 years over at Adler University. I founded the doctorate program specialty track in military psychology. In fact, that started 8 years ago. And last year, 2 of our graduates returned from combat in Afghanistan. One was a psychologist embedded with an Army infantry unit called the Brave Rifles out of Fort Hood. And the other graduate was with a combat stress team who traveled around Afghanistan responding to units that got hit particularly hard. And one of them even wound up with a combat badge because when your forward operating base gets hit, you don't show a card and say, hey, I'm a psychologist, don't shoot me. So he wound up with a combat badge as a result of him being involved in a couple of firefights. And 10 years ago, that was my dream to put together a program. I worked in the VA system back in the 70s, and there's a dreadful lack of people who are either veterans or people either trained to work with veterans on the behavioral health side. And I'm talking about mental health and psychiatry. This presentation is dedicated to the two people who've inspired me to develop the program. One was a fellow colleague, Commander Pat Murphy, United States Navy. We served together for a number of years, and he got his 2 weeks active order, 2 weeks of active duty orders to go to Washington, D.C., reporting on board at the Pentagon on September 10th, 2001. And when that plane hit the Pentagon, it wiped out our entire naval intelligence shop. And Pat was killed as a result of that action. I mean, who would think as a reservist, you go to your 2 weeks active duty in D.C., probably the most dangerous duty is falling off of a bar stool in Georgetown or Alexandria, but getting killed. And we lost a number of reservists that particular day in Washington. And the other is dedicated to a young man. I was an assistant scoutmaster, very gun-ho, member of the Illinois National Guard. Illinois National Guard had the largest deployment since World War II in 2008. And Josh, he was going to make a brilliant officer. He joined the Guard in high school. He couldn't wait to get into the military. He was in college at the time. And while he was in college, he got mobilized. And he got killed 6 weeks in country as a result of an Iranian IED, the type that's able to puncture armored up vehicle. So people say, what's my passion, what motivates me? Besides my family, military veterans of Vietnam and World War II, also close friends and colleagues who've lost their action. And again, one was a reservist, one was a member of the National Guard. I want to mention that because it's really important to note that the war fighting today, 40% of the war fighters overseas are members of the Guard and Reserve. 40%. A couple of weeks ago, we had a little coming back party for a police officer who is with the suburb of Park Forest. He's a member of the National Guard unit. He's a Green Beret, former active duty, and is with a Green Beret Special Forces team that's in the Illinois National Guard. And he couldn't tell us where he was going, but when he returned, he informed us that this fifth deployment, he was in Lebanon. And now when we talk about the war going on overseas, ladies and gentlemen, it's North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Philippines, Thailand. It's, of course, the Middle East. We get together for pizza and beer with my old unit every 6 months, and we welcome back a couple of our members. Both of them were in their early 50s, and they were stationed in Egypt. So it's a very different type of war. But let's talk about the veteran really quickly. This is the oath that anybody who joins the service takes. And it's a very serious oath. Because when you really look at it, think of it this way. Those who are serving in the military or who have served, they're a person who at one point in their life wrote a blank check made payable to the United States of America for an amount up to and including their life. Joining the military, that's part of our agreement, part of our contract. And many pay dearly. This is a memorial service for a United States Marine Corps Reserve unit from the state of Ohio. You're looking at helmets that represent members of that particular Marine Corps Reserve unit that were killed in action. Who were they? Salesmen, firefighters, paramedics, police officers, high school teachers, all individuals who, when the word came for mobilization, they answered the call. This particular unit wound up in the Battle of Fallujah, and we lost a lot of Marines. And, you know, again, the old days of being in the Guard or the Reserve was 2 weeks summer camp, 1 week in a month. Ladies and gentlemen, that's no longer the case. No longer the case. It is not unusual to have already 2 and 3 deployments under one's belt, which is a complicating factor because when the Illinois Guard rotated back in 2009, 2010, we had a spike of suicides among National Guard members. One was really high profile because the young man who killed himself 6 months after return, his dad was chief of psychiatry at a major university. And Dad has taken it upon himself to get the word out there. But it really got bad to the point where Illinois National Guard had to contract with clinicians and have them hang out at the drill sites, at the armories on the weekend, just as a way of reaching out. And you'll hear more about this later on in the talk on suicide. Do you know, last year, the Army lost more soldiers to suicide than to combat. More soldiers were lost to suicide or combat. And you know, how do our people die? You know, how do our people die? You know, we built an entire course around death and dying in the curriculum because if you talk to military people, you know, they know of people who've lost their lives. They know of people who've been badly injured. And when you take a look at today, people die by enemy fire, sometimes friendly fire. Terrorism. Do you know that we have lost service members here in the United States to terrorism? And we almost had a major massacre in Chicago 2 years ago at a National Guard armory. ISIS actually had a plot to kill anywhere from 80 to 100 soldiers. And it was a for real plot. And the FBI was able to terminate that. They die during routine deployments, exercises, or while undergoing training. And today, we also have veterans dying of a variety of illnesses, ranging from, there was just a report regarding 200 troops that were exposed to radiation, plutonium, when a B-52 went down in Spain, and it had nuclear weapons on it. And of course, there was no detonation, but there was radiation contamination. We're also dealing with sailors who responded to the earthquake in Japan and the discovery that a number of them are experiencing high levels of radiation and contaminated radiation poisoning potential is there. We all know about Agent Orange, which was denied for years. Gulf War Syndrome 1 is a real deal. 2 members of my reserve unit have become debilitated because of Agent Orange. The current conflict, of course, the psychiatric problem of suicide, and we can't forget substance abuse. This is what happens to our warriors. And what is the value of those warriors to our country? These are people that are willing to go into battle and confront hell. How many people are willing to sign up for that? Willing to go into a battle and confront the hell there is. And we'll talk about the experience of combat today because it's really changed. It's actually changed pretty dramatically. Today, the operational tempo of troops is beyond any previous conflicts, with the exception of maybe World War II. You know, as I mentioned, we got combat veterans who, oh, I didn't serve in Iraq or Afghanistan. Well, where the hell did you serve? I was in Sub-Saharan Africa, Horn of Africa, Central Africa, North Africa. I was in Lebanon. You know, we have troops in Syria. And some of those are even members of the Guard and Reserve. And that's not to mention the other places we have people fighting this global war on terrorism that, of course, will remain justifiably so classified. But they come from a variety of operations. And This is a reality that we're facing. We're in our 17th year of war. And this is an ongoing war. You talk to the real smart people, the political scientists and scholars, and they talk about a 50 and 100-year war. Do you know that within the next year, the number of veterans from the current global war on terrorism will exceed the number of veterans from the Vietnam War? It's gotten to that critical mass. And that's why they call what's going on as the long war. But I got to tell you something that's really interesting. One of my students, Brianna is a combat vet from Iraq, working on her doctorate. She's going to go back into the VA system and work as a clinical psychologist. I say combat veteran because she worked outside the wire. In these theaters, there's no such thing as a combat or non-combative job. In fact, in a non-combative jobs, you're probably at higher risk with IEDs and snipers and attacks. And she's working at the VA, doing an intake group. And she was really excited. An intake group was veterans coming into the system for the first time. For the first time. And I got a call from her the next day. Hey, Brianna, how did it go? And, you know, her voice sounded pretty strange. I said, what happened? She said, Dr. T, it was a really different experience. And I thought, well, maybe people didn't show up. I said, did people show up? Oh, yeah. I had 11 brand new veterans coming into the VA for services. And I said, well, that's great. Great. Was there a downside to anything? And she said, oh, only one was post 9/11 vet. And I said, who are the other 10? And she said, they were Vietnam veterans. I said, Brianna, these are first-time people walking into the VA wanting mental health services? Yeah, they were Vietnam veterans. And she was floored. Her father was a Vietnam vet. And she said, the war ended 40 years ago. I said, yeah, it did. Can this stuff persist? I said, yeah. We had, in the clinic, we had a surge of World War II veterans in mid to late 1990s. Anybody want to guess what was the trigger? It was a movie. Saving Private Ryan. Yeah. We actually had an influx of World War II vets coming in. We have not even begun to see the wave of veterans from these wars. I'm looking at it this way. We're training clinicians to get ready for what's going to happen 5, 10, and maybe 15 years from now, with our understanding of how prolonged trauma, post-traumatic stress can be. Wanted to give you just some information. 2.6 million have served in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, if you start adding those others that are serving in conflicts in the area, that number goes back. How many are expected to transition back to civilian life? And we're expecting in the next 5 years 1 million new veterans from those serving in the current combat theaters. And it's really different in the sense that it's just not active duty. Yeah, active duty people are serving. National Guard, very actively serving. Reserve components. But I also want to mention military retirees being part of that group. Do you know after 9/11, 18,000 retirees were recalled back to active duty? 18,000. And there was a presidential executive order that was signed a couple of months ago that made it easier to start recalling people from retirement back to active duty. So those of us, those of you who are retired military status, Bart, you might be getting that call. But, you know, that's how things have changed. We talk about generations. I worked in the VA system back in the 1970s. It was, at the time, it was Westside VA. It's now Jesse Brown VA. And in my clinical experience, I actually had a chance to work with World War I vets in the early 70s, mostly with alcoholism. But we've got names for the different generations. The lost generation of World War I, greatest generation of World War II, the forgotten generation of the Korean War. You know, the forgotten generation of the Korean War. I had an assignment in Samsung, Korea, and do you know we still have 8,600 MIAs from Korea? We lost about 54,000 Americans. So Korea, by the way, is still a war that's on a temporary ceasefire since 1954. Of course, we have the Cold War generation, which really wasn't a Cold War. It was pretty heated. The Vietnam, never was there any group of veterans that were treated so badly as the Vietnam vets, by both the population, by the political system, as well as by the VA system at that time. Gulf War I, and we're all struggling what to call this current generation. Post 9/11 is one term. The other term is GWAT, Global War on Terrorism. Give you an idea of the veterans population. It's a shrinking population. And this is where all the alarm bells went off when they said, wow, we make up 4 or 5% of the population, but yet 20% of those who killed themselves in 2009 were veterans. Gee, we're only a small percentage of the population, but figures vary from 1/3 to 40% to 50% of those who are homeless are veterans. Very large population of women veterans homeless on the West Coast. Very interesting. They're trying to study and figure out what that phenomena is a result of or why it's occurring. But, you know, war is war. Being at World War II, Korea, the experience of war is very much the same. Different time, different place. A great quote from a gentleman who was in Patton's Third Army in World War II. One of the things I'm involved at the university, I'm reviewing a lot of the literature, research literature, and case studies in World War I. Quite a bit of information is available out there, primarily from the Brits, regarding shell shock, trauma, and treatment of trauma. And there are lessons to be learned from what we were doing in World War I and World War II versus now. I don't know if you realize it. You know, it was a big tool to treat combat stress in World War II? Hypnosis. Hypnosis. And the various recreational therapies. So we're reaching back to see what we can learn from previous wars, including the Civil War. Some stuff that has been published there. But I want to talk to you about combat stress, and you got to understand what the individual is experiencing to understand the effect it has psychologically and physiologically on the individual. And I'm going to talk about one of the #1 culprits is deployments. You know, I've mentioned members of the Guard, 2, 3, 4, 5 deployments. Even during the Vietnam War, as they said, you had one bite of the apple. Second time, unless you were special ops, you had to volunteer. And the third time you volunteered to go over to Vietnam, you had to see a psychiatrist to make sure you weren't nuts, because you had to be crazy to want to go back a third time. But when we look at deployments, and especially in working with an individual, the number of times they've served in theater. And I'm using the term in theater because you can be in combat and not be in Iraq or Afghanistan. We also talk about the number of times that you've been deployed. And one of the things that was very harsh was extension of deployments. One of my faculty, Dr. Brett Moore, did 2 combat tours as a combat psychologist. Second time he went over for 12 months, he wound up staying 1.5 years. He wound up with a total of 27 months in Iraq because of the surge and because of the extension. And 90 and 120-day extensions have become pretty normal, especially during the Sunni uprising and the insurgency going on. We also take a look at the number of times that you've been in a combat environment. That's key. and the number of times that you've actually been exposed to gunfire, firefights. I've got a colleague with the Marines Reserve Unit. First time in Afghanistan, he was bored out of his mind. 2 years later, he got deployed a second time to Iraq, and he arrived for the Battle of Fallujah. So he went from one extreme to another extreme, where we lost a lot of Marines in that battle. Fallujah 1 and as well as Fallujah 2. The Department of Defense is no longer providing this data, I think for good reason. The number of times people have been deployed. And this is from a few years ago. And trying to get that information, it's no longer available. But, talk to individuals. When did you go, where did you go, and how long were you there? Is not unusual in terms of understanding deployments. Norma Medea was one of my doctorate students in 2010. She's an Army wife, husband, Vietnam veteran, active duty military. And she did a study down in Texas looking at PTSD severity in male combat veterans. And one of her conclusions from her work was that there's a correlation between the increased frequency of deployments, and that is a major risk factor for post-traumatic stress symptoms among combat vets. Now, logically, we all know that. We know that it makes sense that the more you're deployed, the more combat exposure you have, but she was able to put it in statistics and data. And there's also a follow-up study that talked about combat stressors and some of the things such as multiple deployments, high-intensity guerrilla warfare, and the daily living of roadside bombs and IEDs as part of their experience. Well, what is their experience? This is something I put together with a couple of colleagues who were in the National Guard. They were therapists, but they got mobilized into civil affairs positions and military police positions. And I wound up spending most of my military time in DC, and we put together. So this is the perspective from the clinician who's now working civil affairs or military police while deployed. So they have that unique opportunity of both perspectives. And one of the things that was striking was the Vietnam veterans who were deployed to Afghanistan and Iraq would talk about, hey, this is a whole different type of war. This is really different. This is something that I'm not used to. I'm not sure if this is a lot more stress. It's a lot easier. Hey, the bad guys are there. We're here. They're in uniform. We're in uniform. We'll fight it out, versus what their experience was in Iraq and Afghanistan. Well, again, preparing for combat, there's the whole high intensity, getting prepared, making sure you're not complacent. And in the Guard and Reserves, you go through a 30 to 45-day spin-up, either Fort Jackson or Fort McCoy, Wisconsin. Even if you're a doctor or a psychologist or what have you, you go through the combat training. There's also dealing with the psychological impact of combat. Somebody who finally started addressing this back in the 1990s was Lieutenant Colonel Grossman, who did the book on killing and the book on combat. First person who stepped forward and said, we all are looking at what happens afterwards. Let's look at what happens during combat. And that's some of the things that he's highlighted. So, for post 9/11, what's different? Well, one of the things that's different is extension of time. You're not simply counting down to 12 months and you're out. You might be 2 weeks away from returning home, and lo and behold, you've been extended 3 or 4 months. Obviously, the type of missions, and of course, the 18-hour work days are pretty much standard, and multiple deployments. Rumsfeld said, we got to go to war with the army we have. And we've just beaten the hell out of the military. Really have worn them down. with these multiple deployments. There's also the issue of waiting periods prior to going to combat. That picture on the right are Marines sitting out of Fallujah. The temperature is about 124 degrees. And they were sitting out there for days before they got the orders to go in. Picture on the left is Afghanistan. Why does he have that scarecrow? He puts a helmet on the scarecrow and he uses it to flush out snipers. By the way, when you look at casualties and KIAs in theater, number one cause of death, IEDs. Number two cause of death, snipers. Number three cause of death, actual combat. And this is frightening. Number four cause of death, we call it blue on green killing. What does that mean? I'm working with the Afghan colonel here. We're working very close, and maybe we've been working together 6 months. We have a meeting. One day you walk in, sit there, and while we're all sitting there, you pull out your weapon and start executing us. The military lost a 2-star general that way. At a meeting of higher-ranking officials, one of the Afghan generals flipped. And this is when the guys that we think are the good guys working with us flip. And they might have flipped at the last minute or months before. This is all planned. But we've lost people to what we call blue on green killing. The stress of combat, a lot of people mention this, sleeping with a loaded weapon, something that probably persists from generation to generation. Living under field conditions. Hey, if you like camping, would you like to camp for months? Some of the FOBs, forward operating bases in Afghanistan, are in the middle of nowhere, surrounded primarily by insurgents, and here you are living in field conditions, and you might be there for months. There's also the environment that's pretty harsh. I've spent time in the Middle East, and you know, it goes from extreme heat to extreme cold, the rainy season, sandstorm, bugs. God, if you got a phobia about bugs, you're in trouble. I remember we were shipping out dog flea collars that our people could wrap around their boots just to keep the bugs away. And that was primarily in Iraq. And, you know, 99% boredom, 1% sheer terror. Again, it's that need to be vigilant and that fear that are you going to have a good day or are you going to have a bad day? Of course, the fighting that went on, and some of the battles in Iraq, it was hand-to-hand. Even in Afghanistan, hand-to-hand combat, firefights. Boy, you could go to YouTube, and a lot of our guys and girls are actually filming firefights that have been in. It gives you a good sense of what their experience is like. Part of the experience is also being surrounded in an unpredictable number of sniper attacks. The first KIA for the state of Wisconsin was a young woman who was simply by her Humvee, and a sniper got her right between her vest. And as it turned out, her and her two sisters were members of the Wisconsin Guard deployed to Iraq. By the way, her two sisters refused to leave, and they had to bring a general in to order them home because they did not want to leave their units. That's how close that they were. And not knowing who the enemy is. It could be that woman with 4 or 5 kids wearing a burqa that looks pretty innocent, that might be wired up with explosives. One of the tragic cases we had very early in the war was a car pulled up to a checkpoint. Woman obviously very pregnant. Kids in the back seat. Husband driving the car. They got into a big fight, and at the checkpoint they decided to send 4 paratroopers to find out what the hell was going on. They thought it was a domestic. She's screaming and yelling. He's yelling at her. The kids are crying. The 4 paratroopers walked up to the vehicle. Boom. The guy blew the car up, blew his family up, and they killed 4 of our people. That's not unusual. That's not unusual. We even had situations that I was called in on to provide some background information where they'll take individuals who are retarded, or who have severe disabilities, give them heavy coats and money and wire them with explosives and send them into a market. And in one particular situation, 78 people in the market were killed. The woman was developmentally disabled, and of course she did not detonate the coat. She didn't even know what was in the coat, but they gave her money to go buy stuff, which she did. And when they saw the right opportunity, they went ahead and detonated. The guy on the left is a friendly. The guys on the right are insurgents. They're the bad guys. Part of the reaction is dealing with when you capture these guys. You know, maintaining that discipline, maintaining that order. I mean, you might be looking at the guy who killed your partner, killed your commanding officer, and there they are. And the other thing is, you got to understand the psychology of this, okay? When they're fighting insurgents, the insurgents are looking forward to dying. It's not sacrificing their life. Very different mindset. If I could get into an area and kill as many of you before you killed me, I'm going to paradise. I'm very happy. As they say, we love death. We look forward to death. Yeah, you could kill us, but that's not a bad thing, because then I go to paradise, and the more of you I killed, the higher place that I'll have. They call it jihad. They call it a holy war. But it's something that some of our people really have a difficult time in trying to understand. You know, why, you know, an example of this, National Guard unit is pinned down in Afghanistan. And they're getting fire from the house. And they're ready to start returning fire. And all of a sudden, women and children come out of the house and stand in front of the house while they're shooting down. Well, do you order an airstrike? Do you open fire, killing all the women and children before you get to the insurgents? You know, again, it's easy to understand why moral injury is an issue. And again, the complications of that. Mortar attacks. Biggest problem of people returning from theater is lack of sleep. Lack of sleep. In fact, it's often said when your loved one returns from theater, let him sleep for a week. Let her rest for a week. And this is by design. The insurgents will hit every night or every other night basis. So 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, you get the warning sign. You go get your armored gear. You go into the bunker. A shell or two comes in. 99% of the time, the shells don't hit anything. But it's that disruption. That's disruption, which creates severe sleep disorders. You can imagine what the impact it has on the brain and central nervous system. And it really takes time to come back from that. Part of the hardship, and we saw the same with World War II veterans who liberated the concentration camps, had a profound impact on them, is witnessing the atrocities against the civilian population. I didn't give you the after pictures. This is the before picture. The after picture was they cut off the heads of all these guys. So they had the bodies lying there with the heads on the stomach. And these are Iraqi friendlies that were captured by the insurgents. Our people see a lot of some pretty ugly stuff that is done by the population against their own people. One of my colleagues, who's still pretty disturbed by it, she was civil affairs. She had an Iraqi translator. She was Illinois National Guard. And towards the end of her tour, one day her translator didn't show up. And she figured, well, he got scared, no big deal. A week later, a car pulled up to the outer perimeter, which is manned by Iraqis. Boom, they threw out a body and then took off. They looked at the body and they said, oh, I think that's so-and-so, the translator. She had to come out and identify the body. And the body was not executed. He was not executed. He was tortured to death by the insurgents. And she still can't shake that feeling and shake that image out of her head. There's also the issue of taking care of the people that you've lost in combat. stepping on a mine or an IED. There's also the issue of dealing with death. Dealing with death, and often not having enough time to turn around. I spent some time in Israel. Israel has what they call psychological medics. And I remember a case study of a particular army unit that got overrun by Syrians back in the War of '82. They pulled the unit back, and they kept the unit together, and they allowed them a couple of weeks of grieving. They brought in some counselors and some clergy before they brought them back up to the front to get them re-engaged in combat, but not at high risk. They've got a pretty good idea on how to handle this. The other problem, of course, is the issue with IEDs, which, as we now understand, you could be an armored up vehicle, get hit by an IED, you say, hey, I got all my parts, I'm good. But in fact, there's brain damage there. There's a book written by a psychologist called Fixing Hell. He was the chief psychologist in Iraq a number of years ago, colonel. Being the chief psychologist, he had to drive around in helicopter around country to check on his people and how they were doing. During his one-year deployment, he got hit by 3 IEDs. Now, again, he was an armored up vehicle. Went back home, rotated back home over to Walter Reed, and started decompensating. So much so that the commanding officer ordered him to have MRIs done. And it showed that he had brain damage. He had a bruised brain. He had the equivalent of the cumulative effect of IEDs. Right now, we have about 360,000 active duty folks that have been identified as having a TBI related to an IED. And that number is probably much greater because it is so underreported. So underreported. Tammy Duckworth, who's our senator, she's pretty famous. Today she's famous because she's having children in Washington and bringing them in. She was the Illinois National Guard. She was a helicopter pilot, flew a Huey. Took an RPG right under her seat. Fortunately, the blast was so intense, it blew off her legs and part of her arm, but it cauterized, so she didn't bleed out. She passed legislation in Illinois to do a baseline neuropsych assessment and wanted a post neuropsych assessment done to determine if that individual experienced any brain damage as a result of IEDs. And I know the military, if you don't measure something, you don't have to deal with it. And there was a real pushback and a real reluctance to do so, so he had to do it at the local level. This is really the signature wound of today's conflicts, TBIs. Number 1 cause of attack, IEDs on the military. These are some examples. Believe it or not, on the right-hand side, everybody walked away. They're in a cocoon, but the assumption is they're safe. They're not. They will develop a bruised brain. They'll have the experience of a shock wave. This is something that you can measure with some of the high imagery capability that we have, and it will definitely show. Like that colonel. The colonel had a bruised brain and a cumulative effect of 3 IEDs that he experienced. It's something that's pretty predominant because it's easy, and again, major cause in the global war on terrorism. One of my current faculties, also a former student, is Brett Moore. Wrote a book, Wheels Down, with Carrie Kennedy. Carrie Kennedy is still a commander in the U.S. Navy, and she is now an aerospace psychologist. They wrote a book called Wheels Down, both of them being combat vets, that talked about, in their chapter, about IEDs, the blast effects that it has, that also could include damage to lungs and other parts of the body. By the way, one of the things I was going to mention, this entire presentation will be put on the website. You're free to access it, and you're free to go ahead and use it. I'm more concerned with getting the information out there. Gives you a range of some of the problems with a TBI injury. Again, it goes without saying. I mentioned earlier grieving. One of the things we have to get better at is allowing people to grieve. Now, the millennials do something very interesting that I haven't seen before. They will tattoo the names of those that they've lost. I had a student at Adler who served U.S. Navy surface, and she had a bunch of friends on the Cole, a few of them who've gotten killed. And on her back, she has a tattoo of the ship and a tattoo of every name that was KIA'd. I worked with a guy who was Army, and just like in this case, on his arm, he has tattooed the names of people that he served with who were killed in action as a reminder and as a way of memorializing them. Need I say the trauma to the family? You notice mom and dad have a flag. The military's had to adjust. When parents are divorced, mom gets a flag as well as dad gets a flag. And that's not, I could spend a great deal of time talking about the trauma of the injury itself. Hey, the good news, they're pulling people out of the battlefield and surviving. Spent time at Fort Sam Houston. We have a burn unit at Brooke Medical Center, the most advanced burn unit in the world. They are, people are surviving with 95% of their body covered in burns. They get millions of dollars now in research because they're cutting edge in that area. People are surviving. You have some of the VAs that have specializations with amputees or blindness brought about by some of the war wounds and conflicts. And of course, the trauma disability, and that's a Purple Heart that was issued to this young man. Understanding trauma, well, we really started looking at it in the Civil War. There's some great writings on Civil War trauma. We called it nostalgia. Psychotic reactions were called fever, because they thought when somebody hallucinated or had a psychotic reaction, it was a result of a fever in the brain. They also went on to look at it as soldier's heart or irritable heart, because at that time, what were the emotions? In the heart. So you're having emotional problems, you're a soldier, so obviously you have a condition called soldier's heart or irritable heart. And this is funny, in World War I, they started calling it hysteria. And again, the terribleness of the conflict, the casualties. I mean, in the Battle of Somme, the first day of the battle, the British lost 18,000 killed in action. It was just horrible in terms of the severity. And Freud, of course, was around at the time. Alfred Adler was in Austria, and Alfred Adler was actually in the German army, or the Austrian army. I often joke at Adler, my grandfather was in World War I. I says, yeah, my grandfather was trying to kill Alfred Adler, and he was trying to kill my grandfather. They were both on opposite sides. Alfred Adler changed dramatically after his experience as a World War I physician. Changed dramatically, where he developed his whole theory on social justice, as well as theory on social exclusion. The Brits did a lot of filming in 1917 and 18 of shell shock. You could go to YouTube, type in World War I shell shock, and they've got some remarkable black and white films of the various types of shell shock that are there. Now, they called the condition hysteria. And at that time, the military says, wait a minute, hysteria is for women. It was a condition described to women. And hysteria, this is how primitive psychiatry was. They believed hysteria was caused by the uterus moving around. Hey, what can you expect? A bunch of guys are making a diagnosis. What do they know? So the military says, man, we can't call these guys hysteria. Well, they got the same symptoms, but they're not women. So they eventually looked at other terms, including combat trauma as well as shell shock. And that's why we have the term shell shock. Because the Army, the British Army, later the US Army, didn't want the term hysteria used. And of course, we know what shell shock is. And a lot has been learned from going back and studying the effect of blast and blast injuries in World War I. And it's interesting in terms of the range of symptomatology. Again, this is from the British military, World War I. One could include almost a hyperventilation and almost a histrionic reaction, and that's the one on the left. And the other reaction is catatonia. There's a film that was done by John Huston, who's a member of the OSS, and it's called Let There Be Light. Has anybody seen that film, Let There Be Light? Okay, one of you have. The film is about real psychological and psychiatric casualties of World War II. The film, when it was made after the staff, general staff saw the film, they said, oh my God, we can't release this. And it was classified until the 1980s. Now, what you see is not actors. It's real psychiatrists, real nurses, and real patients. And it's about their return from Europe, their treatment, and recovery. And it's available on YouTube. The name of it is called Let There Be Light, the first well-documented film regarding psychological or psychiatric casualties. The other term that was used in World War II was going berserk. And that's a depiction of a soldier in the Pacific Theater having the experience of what I call going berserk. We also called it battle fatigue. Those are some pretty good photographs of what battle fatigue looks like. And of course, we had denial. Patton was obviously, he got into trouble, he went into the tent, he wanted to shoot those individuals who were psychiatric casualties. He didn't see it as an injury. In the Korean conflict, we called it combat exhaustion. And the Army doctrine back at that time was if you developed combat exhaustion, it was because there was something wrong with you, that it was a pre-existing condition, not a result of what you experienced. And of course, the psychological trauma today, the 1,000-yard stare as a result of being in conflict. I mentioned the first real study of the experience of combat was Lieutenant Colonel Grossman. His 2 books on killing and on combat. Military started using him to prepare troops who were being deployed. And they found lower psychological casualty rates in the units that he spent time with, explaining the whole physiology, neurophysiology of combat. And he gets into a lot of details. Again, this is stuff that you could go ahead and read. And you take a normal body and put him in a combat or her in a combat situation, it has a dramatic effect, a dramatic impact, neurologically as well as physiologically. And he talks about this and talks about what it actually looks like from a neuropsychological perspective. Profound impact. Something that I would say we probably underestimated. 2 of my faculty who are veterans who work for the U.S. Army down at Fort Sam Houston, the Army's putting a lot of money on how do you build resiliency? How do you screen and identify good resiliency? How do you increase the resiliency of your troops? What can we do to better step down individuals coming back from deployment? Because it's a manpower issue. Like with the Israeli military, if you're losing people to psychological casualties, it really shrinks your pool. So that's been an initial direction that's been taken with the military. Then, of course, we have post-traumatic stress in combat, and the correlation between PTSD, of course, and a heavy combat environment. And this is pretty interesting. There's a movement afoot to change it from disorder, because disorder is kind of like saying, well, there was something wrong with you to begin with, to injury. Do we call it a traumatic brain disorder? We call it a traumatic brain injury. We might need to relook and re-examine and talk in terms of post-traumatic stress injury. And again, some of the experiences of Vietnam vets, the numbers. And one of the things that we know in terms of intervention, the sooner you're able to intervene, the better. After the actual trauma, and that's what the combat stress teams do, or later on when the symptoms start appearing. But the problem is when you don't address it, like why are World War II veterans reporting reemergence of their symptoms? Because they wind up with either a delayed PTSD or chronic PTSD that's pretty well repressed. And our two founders, Adler University was founded in 1954 by two Army Air Corps psychologists who had a vision of creating an advanced school and, of course, later on, a program training people specifically to work with veterans. And that's looking at the treatment of chronic PTSD. Much more complicated when substance use and abuse is involved. There was a great VA program pre-Hurricane Katrina. I know a lot about the program. I put a friend of mine in there, a Vietnam veteran. Chronic relapser, suicidal, in and out of treatment for 10 years. And the VA in New Orleans had a program where it was 1 year inpatient. 1 year inpatient. He completed that program and remained sober for the rest of his life. But again, he had PTSD. He was in battle away in Vietnam. And he drank and couldn't get sober. And obviously, for good reason. He had PTSD, which was not addressed. And back in that day, it was, we got to address the sobriety. You still do, but they ignored the PTSD. And finally, he was able to go ahead and sober up. In closing, how can you help? Well, obviously, never ask the question, have you ever killed anyone? Yeah, please, don't ask that. If somebody starts talking about it, shut up and listen. The most effective thing that we could do is listen. We're in a process. Are you familiar with the concept of CIT, Crisis Intervention Training with Law Enforcement? We are now working with veterans as part of CIT. Yesterday morning, I was at the Chicago Police Academy, and as part of our week-long CIT course, they get 2 hours in how to work with veterans. Next year, we're going to be launching a 1-year advanced CIT that focuses only on veterans. And the Chicago Police Academy also trains all the other departments because they realize they're running into more. They've always run into veterans. Now they're going out of their way to identify veterans and to utilize veteran services, just very much like the veterans courts. It's okay to say thank you for your service. Hey, but most important of all, listen to their stories. Listen to what they have to say. And what I did, I'm not going to go through these, tips for helpers, do's and don'ts. Additional tips for helpers. And that's a professional person or a paraprofessional person. And I also included just a whole bunch of different resources that are available and training. This is free stuff, from military cultural competency to dealing with brain injury and PTSD, resources to the Soldiers Project, Give an Hour, Military One resources, some recommendations for books, additional training. Clinicians that have no background in working with vets, as part of their training, we make them take these courses. They're free, they're online, and they're good. Included some references. In closing, General MacArthur said, "The soldier above all prays for peace, for he must suffer and bear the deepest wounds and scars of war." And also somebody who is very much affected by war. He, in his mid-40s, served in the trenches of France. I'm talking about Winston Churchill. And he said something that always stuck with me. When we forget our warriors, our society will begin to crumble. And last but not least, hey, freedom is not free. Hey, this is the price that we pay. Thank God we've got men and women who are willing to step forward, swear into the military, and do those things that many of us could not even conceive in doing. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. And I brought a couple of articles here regarding the education about vets, and I could put them in front here on break if they want to. Oh, yeah, sure.
Does anyone have any questions? I have a question.
Yeah.
Okay, so my husband is a combat veteran. When I saw him on R&R back when, I saw him from a distance. He was a thin man. He looked dusty.
Yeah.
Pretty intense individual,
Yeah.
anyways. So that was back in 2009. I didn't think he had any real issue. He pretty much keeps everything to himself.
Yeah.
The big problem is now his anxiety. It is killing him.
Yep.
He has literally taken steps to stop drinking. So that is all the substance abuse and all of that. Not that anyone that knows my husband, he was never part of that. But this is a huge issue. And this is what I find many of the veterans coming back immediately, hey, I have PTSD. Do you have PTSD or is it anxiety? And is it contributing? And what else can you do?
Yeah, it can be combat trauma.
Yeah.
One of the problems is a lot of internalization. There are great resources out there. One of the places that's a healing place in Chicago is called the National Veterans Art Museum. They put on programs. I've seen vets take their stories, write their stories, and have them played out. There's no necessarily one right way to recovery. Mm-hmm. There are many different ways of recovery. What's bad is when internalizes, pretend it's not going on. This is why I love the vet centers. Why do we have vet centers? Because vets got crappy service at the VA hospitals. Yep. Somebody could walk in the vet center and boom, they're there, there's service there. And rest assured, a lot more people are getting help. But part of it is the individual dealing with their own denial.
Yeah, and being effective and being the family member of that person and trying to have some impact, positive impact.
But look I was talking about an Army colonel, a psychologist, chief of psychology. The general had to, I am ordering you to get an MRI. Yeah. I don't want to. You are being ordered to get an MRI. Your behavior's been erratic. Boom, the results come back. Wow, did you know you had this? And for him, that was his awakening. He wound up writing a book about it. He said, even though I'm a shrink, I was in total denial. Yeah. And this is what the family told me I was doing. I didn't believe it. And, he just got to that point. Yeah. Well, got to that point.
I wish I could have that same effect with my husband.
Yeah. I was going to mention the faculty that we're using at Adler. We have 11 faculty. Out of the 11 faculty, 10 are prior military. Excellent. Out of the 10 that are prior military, 6 of them are Iraq, Afghan war veterans. One's a Vietnam era veteran. And 2 of my faculty are still in the reserves and guard. And I think that's really important to have also clinicians. These are doctorate level trained clinicians who also bring that experience. Because again, are we going to sit here wait until 2030 before we start saying the wave of people coming into the system?
That's a good point.
Good.
Any other questions?
Yes, sir.
Quick comment for anyone who's looking for a combination of CEUs, but more important, just excellent training, is the National PTS Center, which is available through the VA. It's online. They're fantastic courses and programs, and
I think I had a reference there. I might have, yeah, I had a reference there. But yeah, some great training. Some great training. Yeah.
My question is,
It's not on.
now it's on. So sexual trauma causes PTSD, being in combat causes PTSD. I'm curious if someone's experienced both, if there's...
It's a cumulative effect.
Yes, and if it's, I guess my question is, when that's compounded, is there special treatment that needs to be done with that, and how is that addressed?
Yeah, I'm thinking of, she was actually a student who was sexually assaulted, had a couple of IEDs, and some real close calls. And she had all that going on at the same time. And this is why we need what we call integrative care, holistic care, where somebody could go and get all of those addressed. The VA is like an aircraft carrier. When it needs to make a turn, it takes 20 miles to make that turn. So it's been a slow system. We are now seeing specific programs dealing with military sexual trauma. And one of our VAs have that. And they're also concurrently doing the TBI as well as the post-traumatic stress. Yeah.
Doctor, hi. I'm a judge advocate in the Army Reserve, former active duty. So I see and have seen all the soldiers, coming back, getting in trouble. Is there any research or any data that addresses that correlation between injury and some of the ramifications such as legal
Yeah, part of it is high-risk behaviors. An example of that is a striker unit that returned to Fort Carson up in Colorado. They had a significant number of DUIs, traumatic vehicle accidents as a result of risky behavior, as well as a high arrest rate for bar fights. When the Special Forces units returned from Afghanistan, we're talking about a year later, in a 6-week period down at Fort Bragg, there were 2 murder-suicides, killing oneself and killing the spouse, and then there was a 3rd murder of a spouse. And this was a real shocker to the Army because some of these SF people that went over were seasoned with prior combat experience. And the military is recognizing that, in fact, that when you ignore treatment, young men and young women will get into trouble. And these are some of the things that they see. Now, on the civilian side, we have the veterans courts. We have the veterans courts. I know in Illinois, they just passed legislation to make it easy for every county to have one. And they've been pretty successful. They've been around now for about 8 or 9 years. But the important thing is providing services. There's a Army JAG, former Army JAG in Chicago, that is doing some of the cases of soldiers in the field who've killed civilians and now they're locked up. His name is John Carr, C-A-R-R. And they've been going in and re-adjudicating some of these cases and looking at, in this one particular case, remember, this made the news. The guy who walked into the village and killed, I think, 28 Afghans, he was, and this is part of the public hearings on this guy. They were told that this guy had a severe TBI from an accident in Iraq, an auto accident in Iraq. There are no rules of the road. And medical said, no, this guy should not go. And they overruled medical, shipped this guy over. He was a sniper attached to a Special Forces unit. He was drinking out there, went into a blackout, went in, killed all the villagers, reported back on duty. After he was relieved of his watch, he went up to his commanding officer and said, "Sir, I think I did something very horrible. I'm not sure what I did." He was in a complete blackout. Now, he's at Fort Leavenworth, of course, and they've been, through legal advocacy, making sure that he gets all the treatment services he needs. So it's kind of hit and miss. I'm more than happy to talk with you a little later on about that. Good. One more. Yes, sir.
Yes, I'm a Vietnam veteran. I spent 365 days in combat with the 5th Infantry Division by the DMZ. We lost 514 of our men. It's taken me 40 years to talk about it. My question is, looking at all the medication and all the programs that there's been for PTSD, there's been a very low emphasis on the spiritual element, the moral aspect, which I think needs to be addressed, which is the only thing that carried me through.
Yeah. I'm a very strong advocate. Somebody says, what is your treatment model? And I say it's a biopsychosocial spiritual model of treatment. That the spiritual component has to be there along with the psychosocial as well as physical. And one of my gripes with education today is even in the mental health field, we tend to ignore spiritual aspects. We try to compensate by that by bringing in clergy to talk to our students. Ideally, I would like a course on looking at spirituality and recovery. And it's not a component, it has to be an element as part of the overall treatment. But that would be my big gripe today. I think we've lost something with devaluating or de-emphasizing spiritual care. And that's a wrong turn that we've taken.
All right then, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So the impact of Chaplain Kaiser, this is his conference, he should be here. So we're going to take a 10-minute break before we have Dr. Buechner come up. So feel free.